Afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you again and to welcome you back to the extraordinary excitement which is pervading this Philharmonia Hall. As it's the finals of this particular competition, if you have listened to everything that has gone before, it is rather an exquisite moment. There will be two finalists tonight, one from South Korea and the other from Japan. But I'd like to today examine what happened last night, because it was very, very interesting. The thing with these three concertos, of course, is that they're all Russian. The second thing about them is that they all created a furor when they were first performed. They all attracted very negative criticism. Two of them have been very well accepted now, I would say. But perhaps the Prokofiev is still such a revolutionary sound, even though it was written, I think, around 1913. I just wanted to say a little bit about how Russian music evolved. We tend to think of it as always having been there, but in fact it wasn't. Mikhail Glinka was really the father of Russian orchestral music, and he had a very interesting life. He didn't really start off as a musician. He started off as a civil servant who was interested in music. And then he became more and more interested in it. And as I've been chatting on about the importance of literature in the period, after reading Pushkin and Gogol, he decided to write an opera. And the opera was called A Life of the Tsar, and it was first performed in 1836. What has that got to do with Rachmaninoff? Well, Glinka influenced Tchaikovsky, who influenced Rachmaninoff, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Stravinsky. So these influences all overlap, and I think it's quite important to think about this when you're hearing Rachmaninoff's grand, magnificent melodies, that they don't just come out of the ether. There is a tradition there. All right, the concerto itself, written 1900, 1901, and it was derided by contemporary critics when it was first performed. The interest for us, I think, is that Rachmaninoff at this time suffered from what we call clinical depression. He'd been suffering from this for about 3 years. And if you look at the dedication to the concerto, it was dedicated to Dr. Nikolai Dahl. And this doctor treated Rachmaninoff with hypnotherapy and psychotherapy. Now, it's very interesting, you know. The hypnotherapy, he hypnotized Rachmaninoff and said, "You will write a great concerto. It will be superior to the ones you have already written." And strangely enough, this sort of hypnosis actually worked. And we ended up with this extraordinarily popular second piano concerto in C minor, opus 18. I find the story amazing, really. Although the concerto is rather pessimistic in some ways, and it has a feeling of fatalism about it. But it took a long time for Rachmaninoff to believe in himself. I find this so hard to understand. If you were such a great concert pianist and other aspects of being a composer, you'd think you would have confidence, but that's not the case at all. Sergei Belyavsky in the final decided to play this concerto, and let's begin at the beginning and listen to the first movement. I felt he began a little bit fast. I quite like a very slow beginning to this, where you feel that the composer is exploring, and then he comes to his final resolution, and the whole work begins its enormous momentum. Let's listen to that. Yes, he played this in an extremely authoritative and convincing manner. I mean, you wouldn't expect anything else from a finalist from this particular competition. Shall we listen to a little bit of the Adagio, Sostenuto, the second movement, where he became quite lyrical, I think, and rather sensitive and nuanced in the performance. Right, and that was very nice, and I think that the final movement, he became quite, well, very, very convincing. I thought he became very passionate and very lyrical. So let's hear a little of the final movement of this Rachmaninoff. I've always wondered how wonderful it must be to be a concert pianist. I mean, if you're not a concert pianist, you probably want to be one in a way that they would never want you to imitate, but all the same. All right, we move on then to Kamil Pokholitz, and he had chosen to play the first Tchaikovsky, which of course is another extraordinarily popular, and it's been recorded by just about everybody, this particular concerto. It's in B-flat minor. And Tchaikovsky also attracted heavy criticism when he first performed this for actually Nikita Rubinstein. Rubinstein or Nikolai Rubinstein. Rubinstein was supposed to be performing it for the first time. So when Tchaikovsky went through the work with him, he said it was, let me read, worthless, unplayable, fragmented, vulgar, and very derivative, which of course depressed Tchaikovsky quite a lot. He was supposed to be performing this, and so that didn't actually happen. So eventually, though, the work was accepted, but by a very fine pianist and musician, Hans von Bülow, who thought that the entire work was original and noble. And I think that those two adjectives describe this particular concerto extremely well. So the premiere was not in Moscow, but actually in the United States, in Boston, on October 25th, 1875. Bülow was the soloist, and the Boston Symphony Orchestra, under a conductor I don't recognise, Wilhelm Gehrig. Of course, there have been so many recordings of this concerto. They're innumerable. I mean, just about every fine pianist has recorded this. But I very much enjoyed Pokolets' interpretation of it, because he brings a particular type of understanding rubato to to everything he plays, and he plays with a great sensitivity. I think I've said this to you before. So let's listen to the first movement, the huge beginning of this great concerto, the theme of which is actually never repeated in that movement, this grand opening gesture. So let's listen to that. Yes, very, very fine maestoso opening to it, and definitely Tchaikovsky marked this maestoso, and certainly Pokolets played it with a great deal of majesty, I thought. The next movement, the slower movement, is an andantino semplice. That's what Tchaikovsky marks it. Now this, of course, leaves it open to all sorts of interpretations. And I was very impressed with some of the soloists in the orchestra, the Pomeranian Symphony Orchestra in Bydgoszcz. And the flautist was very fine, I thought. So I play the beginning of the andantino because it has a flute solo. Let's listen to that. Right. I think that the orchestra, the Pomeranian Philharmonic Orchestra in Bydgoszcz, actually is often neglected in these concerto competitions, but they do an enormous amount of work rehearsing and playing in some synchronization with artists that they don't really spend enough time with to come to some sort of joint agreements. I think they do a marvellous job. And the flautist there, I think we will listen to him. The final movement, Tchaikovsky marks Allegro con fuoco, which of course you understand as meaning with fire, but I want to play the final part of this, the Allegro vivo, of the third movement, because I think Pocholec grasped this in a way that was really quite dramatic. Well, as you might imagine, this very fine Polish pianist, Kamil Pocholec, got a tremendous reception for that performance of the Tchaikovsky, and well-deserved, in my opinion. He is a great natural musician. Right, we move on to perhaps one of the most difficult piano concertos ever written, the most challenging for pianists, certainly, is the Prokofiev Second Piano Concerto, written in 1913. And when I think of it, what effect it must have had then, because, I mean, the effect it had on me last night was fairly dramatic. So, again, it went through all sorts of reconstructions and rewriting and all sorts of revisions. It was finally reconstructed by Prokofiev in 1923 for a premiere in Paris on the 8th of May 1924. Now, I mean, the inspiration for this work is rather a sad story. I mean, a lot of Prokofiev was dominated by war, of course, and death. This one is dedicated to Maximilian Schmidthoff, who was a friend of Prokofiev's in St. Petersburg at the conservatory, and who committed suicide in 1913. He wrote a very, very moving suicide poem, or quoted a poem by Lermontov about the uselessness of the life ahead of him, and wrote a farewell letter containing this poem to Prokofiev. It has formidable piano challenges for any soloist, to the point where, at one point, Martha Argerich would not perform it. Kissin only recently, I think, decided to learn it, and it's created a sort of extraordinary moment of achievement if you can actually perform this work. I'd like to just play the opening first, the first movement, which is the Andantino. It's a very quiet way to begin a piano concerto, a big contrast to the two that we have just listened to. But things get fairly busy later on. Philip Linoff playing the Prokofiev number 2, that's the opening movement. I'd like to listen to a little bit of the Allegretto, which is part of this first movement, which is quite in huge contrast. But of course, Philip Linoff looks every inch the concert pianist, the young concert pianist, it seems to me. He's only 20. And to dominate a work like this is an achievement that is almost incomprehensible, I suppose. Let's listen to this. Yes, right. So we move on to the second movement, which is a scherzo. And somebody's bothered to count the number of semiquavers in this extraordinary non-stoppable scherzo, and there are 1,500 semiquavers that go from the beginning to the end. I haven't counted them, but I think people come up with some extraordinary ideas and figures about things, don't they? Let's listen to the beginning of that. What's important about this, I'd like to point out a couple of things. The concerto is very famous for its grueling cadenzas. The cadenza for the first movement, where the soloist appears with no orchestral accompaniment, lasts for 5 minutes. And it is unbelievably challenging. It's just unfortunate that I don't have time to play the complete cadenzas for you this afternoon. But I suggest that you watch the streaming online, the recording that you can access on the website of the Paderewski competition. And just listen to this entire concerto, because then you'll be able to listen to the uninterrupted cadenza in its context. Right, I'd like to go on to the third movement, play some of that. It's a very menacing movement called Intermezzo, and it is quite fast-paced. So let's listen to the beginning then of the third movement. Right, and I'd like to conclude this afternoon with the conclusion of the Prokofiev II with Philip Linov. I can't really comment. It was just rather overwhelmingly virtuosic and spectacular to watch, and the filming of it was really quite outstanding. So let's watch the conclusion of this particular demanding concerto. Yes, well, he got a wildly enthusiastic reception from the audience with that particular performance. But there's a great temptation, in piano competitions to judge the winner from the concerto stage, because it's very, very tempting to do this. And what happens is that people tend to forget that there are many stages before this and many pieces of music. And the important thing is consistency. This is what Kevin Kenner said about Avdieva when she won the Chopin competition. People said, well, why? And he said, because she was so consistent. And I think that this is a very important thought. Never really judge the entire competition on the final concerto, however spectacular it might be. Since I've been talking to you, a young lady has been rehearsing the Tchaikovsky in the hall, and it's been very distracting for me to try and talk to you because it's rather brilliant to listen to. Anyway, I'll probably see you tomorrow and have a chat about what happened this evening. This evening's full of events, and we will have the winner by then. And of course tomorrow is the laureates concert. So until then, bye-bye then.